So good afternoon. I'm Amanda Brock, and I'm going to spend somewhere between 30 and 50 minutes with you talking about open source audits. Now, I didn't expect the audience would be quite as big as it is, because you've got a very dry topic midway through the afternoon on the first day of conference when people are starting to get to know each other and networking. But I sort of planned on this basis and expected that we would probably have more of a collaborative discussion, or you guys are going to fall asleep if I just stand here and talk at you for the next half hour or so. So what I've got is a slide deck that I'll take you through, but I'm really happy if we stop, if people have their own views or thoughts, or even some advice for me if you've done more audits than I have. In this room, just to start with, who's worked on an open source audit before? Yeah, so it's about half and half. That's kind of what I thought it would be like. So to explain why I'm the person talking to you about this, I'm a technology lawyer. I've been a lawyer for a quarter of a century, and you get to be the first audience I've spoken to since I hit that landmark in my career, which is very, very aging. But even a quarter of a century where I've mostly practiced technology law isn't enough to really qualify you to do anything that's very specific about open source. And the thing that in most ways qualifies me to do anything around open source is that I spent 5 years working for a UK company called Canonical. And Canonical distributes the open source operating system and various adjuncts to Ubuntu. And I joined them in 2008, early in 2008. And it was quite, for a lawyer, different experience. I don't know if there are many roles in Europe or the world even where lawyers get to be totally integrated into a project, frankly, because most projects can't afford lawyers to come and join them and be part of that project day to day. So I had a real baptism of fire joining Canonical, which is a commercial entity, but which at that stage was finding its feet. And I set up the legal infrastructure and the legal team there and managed that for the 5 years I was there. And what I found was that gradually, over a few months, I began to unlearn what I'd been taught as a lawyer. And I remember I was a technology lawyer, and I wasn't just moving into an open source environment where I thought I knew what open source meant, but was really going to be given a baptism of fire. I also was moving from a traditional technology environment to agile and lean development. So lots and lots of things as a lawyer I'd always taken for granted, like certainty, a nice specification at the back of a contract, all became totally redundant. And I had to learn ways of making that work in an environment where if I was wrong, somebody would start speaking to me with IANAL, but you're wrong. And I would have to be able to justify any position that I thought I and Canonical or Ubuntu ought to take with respect to anything and everything. And that's a very different way of working for lawyers. Getting used to the openness of a community and people just going off and doing things was kind of strange too. The first couple of times it happened, you know, the reaction is WTF, how on earth did somebody just go and do that? Who's controlling them? Where's their line manager? And actually, it's a matter of unlearning the legal stuff to understand collaboration and freedom and how that can be harnessed in positive ways through the use of governance and project-specific parameters so that everybody knows what their role is, ought to be, what's okay, what's not okay, and how to ask for forgiveness later. So for me, Canonical was a bit of a baptism of fire, but I absolutely loved being in that development community because I spent my days with really, really smart people doing really clever things that they thought was for the best. They were trying to change the world, at least we thought we were changing the world. And one of the reasons I left wasn't that I didn't like open source anymore, it was that I started to get a bit bored. And I started to get bored gradually as I had the same conversation repetitively. And at that point in time, open source wasn't really something that was commercially adopted across all corporates. There's been a huge shift in the last 5 to 10 years in how corporates behave about open source, how they contribute and how they adopt. And I would say it's an inevitability, but at the time it didn't feel like that. And the conversation I was having day in, day out was speaking to the legal departments of big international technology or hardware companies and working with them to get them to a point of understanding about open source so that they could accept things like our contract terms or our licensing decisions. And over a period of time, I really got fed up with having those parrot-like conversations. So my tact was to go out to conferences that didn't involve lawyers and to try and speak to the technology people and the commercial people and convince them, or even just explain to them the things that their lawyers were getting upset about and why the lawyers were upset. Because I was constantly being told that the legal teams were a blocker to open source being used in organizations. Sort of moving on from that, I think there's been a mind shift, as I said, in the adoption and use of open source. And it's not that there weren't always some major companies, the IBMs of this world, who were big open source users. It's more that it's become the norm, and it's become the norm as projects have expanded away from core Linux. And you see, even if you track an organization like the Linux Foundation, how the projects have moved further out. So you get away from the operating systems into the automotive sector, for example, and then perhaps from automotive into mobile or into financial or power and energy, which is one of the big things where we're seeing open source being adopted now. So I think it is now an inevitability, and we understand that open source is going to be used. And the question is, how do we use it? What do we do? And I think for most corporates, the issue is going to be what their open source policy is and whether or not they have compliance. And that's what puts people off, turns them off and on from open source. When I left Canonical, I still do some consultancy around open source, but I did a lot of legal work for companies and individuals who were in projects on open source. And it was kind of difficult. And it was difficult because the companies, as I've already said, didn't understand what was going on. And you needed to get everybody to a sort of collaborative place. Now, one of the ways of doing that is to sit down and draft out your scope and your policy. What is it that we want to do? How are we going to do it? And you get into a sort of chicken and egg situation where it's never clear whether you should start with a policy around open source or an audit. So they asked me today to talk to you guys. The sort of remit I was given was if I was talking to a corporate entity, why would you want to do an audit? So what's an audit for you? Why would you do it? How do you do it? And what do you expect to achieve from that? So for me, an open source audit is a way of creating a housekeeping around open source that is probably better than you're going to have in your proprietary environment. It's a way of discovering what your code base actually is, looking at anything that's been undisclosed in that code base. Actually, as a starter, you're going to be scoping out what that code base is, if it's a repository, if it's multiple repositories. And once you've got that code base, working out whether there are license issues, compliance issues, etc. We'll come on to more detail. So why would you have an open source audit? Any thoughts? Has anybody who's done one had a particular reason for doing one? You're probably not allowed to answer that because you have all the answers.
Licensing.
Licensing, okay. So legals? Checking your IPR, okay. So having gone from Canonical, where I didn't really do audits because we didn't need to, because it was our whole business, and the issues that came up there were the ones that other companies, our day-to-day issues were other companies' audit issues. I think there are a bunch of reasons why you audit, and the first one is good hygiene. And when I talk about good hygiene, I talk about governance and the norms and the rights of open source compliance and governance. So everybody wants to have their licenses in order. Everybody wants to know that their software is usable by them in the way that they want to use it, and that the distribution that they'll undertake isn't going to cause any problems. So as a matter of course, having that good hygiene, you would think would be the main reason to have an audit, but it's not been my experience. What I've found is that money is what focuses minds and has focused most of my clients to have an open source audit. And it will be something like they're going to go through an IPO, they're going to take investment, or they want to do some other form of borrowing or market capitalization work. And in order to have that signed off, what they generally find is that they need to give the city or the investor some form of warranty or promise that their open source software has been properly handled and is properly managed and is compliant. So I've found that the financial arrangements tend to be the main trigger. Thinking about this sector, and actually I used to work with one of you, Rob and I worked together on a mobile phone company, or in a mobile phone company, on mobile financial services for a year or two. And we looked for our sins at AML and KYC and other regulatory matters in financial services across 12 emerging markets back then. So it was a lot of fun in the Wild East. I think in this sector, what you'll see more and more is not so much the litigation or legal issues, the good licensing, the IP issues that will promote or prompt you to have an audit, but rather the regulatory issues. And I guess this talk will sort of bring together a number of different talks that I've been to today. I don't know if any of you sat in Andrew Katz's talk this morning where he was talking about open chain, which is an attempt to achieve a compliance standard through a specification and some training. They've created a curriculum around training and what makes a good open source product with good hygiene. He was talking in that talk about MiFID and the financial regulators across borders pushing people to have standards and to have compliance in their software code base. So actually, I think that will increasingly, as we see the adoption of open source move more and more into the fintech area, be a reason for audits. So how do you go about an audit? Again, I was talking to Andrew Katz about this before today, and one of the things that I sort of skipped over was the start point. And the start point, I think, is probably really crucial. So you start by scoping out what it is you want to do, as you do with any project. But one of the things that he was sort of encouraging me to share with you is reviewing what's already there. So often what you'll find is that there will be some form of open source policy, whether it's well advised or not is another thing, but there will have been some practice, some behavior that your DevOps team will have used over a period of time that shouldn't just be dismissed out of hand. And it will also give you an opportunity to understand the sort of tone of the way the organization works and how they want to pull this together. So if you're sitting in an organization like Canonical where everybody's in jeans and t-shirts, you'll probably, I have to watch which names I use. I worked for a gaming company where I did their open source audit and policy for them. They're very much on a very informal basis, so they do want rules and regulations, but they don't want to seem very prescriptive with the developers and how they contribute and how they manage open source. Whereas when you look at some of the big corporates, you might find that you have to work in a slightly different way, that whilst the development community within that organization will behave in a way that follows development norms, the language that's used and the way that things are described may well be very different. So sitting down and understanding the tone of where the organization's going, understanding if there's anything specific that's happened in that organization that's drawn a reason for the audit or the attempt to tidy up the open source software, sort of getting those parameters is very important, but also working out who it is that's going to be in that team. Now, from the in-house team, you definitely need technologists and you definitely need legal. It may be that you're not big enough to have legal, but I think if you're going to go through an audit, you may well have your own legal advisors, even if it's an external counsel that you bring in. And one of the things that I would caution you about is making sure that you've got the right expertise, particularly around the legal area. There aren't actually that many lawyers who really understand open source, and frankly, anybody who's in it knows the rest of the lawyers. So if it's somebody who we don't all know the name of at least, then you're probably not getting the right advice. And what I find with friends who are open source legal practitioners is that they will regularly be asked to go and do audits or to work on a draft policy, but they may not be asked directly by a company. They may actually be asked by a major law firm because they don't have that skill set internally within the law firm to do that kind of work. They don't feel comfortable with it, so they'll outsource what I suppose is quite a niche expertise. The second thing I'd caution there is to make sure you've got the right decision makers in the room, because it's terribly easy to end up with well-intentioned people who actually can't make decisions. And you might want to go back and look at the internal documents if any existed and see where your starting point is. So I've worked on audits where the company's policy has been no GPL. But then the reality, when you've sat down and looked at the code base, is it's full of GPL. I've also worked for companies where, and it's sort of classic, you go into the room to sit and talk to them about how they're going to manage open source, and the development team sits on one side, the legal team sits on another, and the commercial guys sort of float around at the back, but everybody's split into their skill set or their perceived skill set. And when you ask the same company, the same organization, the same question across those different functions, the answer can be so, so different. So I've asked, do you have any open source in your organization? And seen lawyers say, no, absolutely none, because it's completely against our company policy. And the developers have just laughed because they've never had that conversation in a room with their lawyers before, and actually their code base is full of it. So I think it's important to have somebody who, if they themselves don't have the power to make that decision, can easily access and get a speedy response. And audits can be done in a very short period of time. I did one for a company that was being sold to a US in 3 days. And basically, I worked with their engineering team for 3 days. And when I wasn't asleep, I was either on the phone to them or going through spreadsheets and lists of software and reading licenses. Normally, you won't get somebody with that sort of urgency around the process. So if I needed a decision, I could phone straight into the main board because they really wanted to be sold and they needed this warranty. That's not normally how it works. You normally have to go back through a process of approvals. So I think it's really important to sort of try and work out where you think there are going to be questions and what those are going to be, and who the approvers will be, rather. So when you start the audit, it's very important also to understand which code bases you're going to look at, which repositories. And I've put a few different names, and Flexera, Jeff's in the room. Physology is the only one there that's not a proprietary service. But you probably need to start with a tool, and you need to have worked out what your code base is and run that tool on the code base. Now, feel free to jump in if you're going to tell me I'm wrong, but the way that I've seen this work is you'll start by running a tool given to you by the proprietary company that will give you an idea of the size of the job they think they've got, and they will then give you a price to do the work for you. And we'll come in a minute to what the work actually is and what the outputs from it are. What I've seen is that when you're doing these audits, depending on your reason for it, physology may be discounted because and again, very clearly depends on your goal. The end that you need to achieve for many of these is to give the warranty that I mentioned. And we'll talk at the very end about what the warranties you can give and may give are. But when you give something like that, they may well want to attach it back to a commercial product and to somehow qualify or promote the warranty based on that. So you may find that actually they'll require a specific product, or they'll look for a state-of-the-art or state-of-the-industry standard from you in those. So once you get that bit of code run against your repository, you're going to get some output. Now, this is one company's, this is Black Ducks, and it's just a drop from one of their projects. I couldn't use any of the ones that I've worked on because they're all under confidentiality, and I can't really disclose. I was scared that I'd get something wrong and you'd be able to work out whose it was. So when you look at something like this, it gives you a very good breakdown of what's undisclosed in your code base, what's disclosed, but perhaps you didn't understand the licensing on. These reports tend to come in fancy UXs now, where you can have a nice set of information, and the data can be cut many different ways in the dashboard. And then you're going to use that, just to be fair, I've put Flexera in at this point as opposed to Black Duck. You're going to use that to work through the document that's been delivered to you and to analyze what the issues around that code are. So obviously you're going to start by prioritizing your actions. These are summaries, because I couldn't get the whole thing on there, of what Flexera will give you as priorities 1 to 4. Priorities 5 and 6 are left to be defined by the organization, which goes back to your initial kickoff and what it is you're trying to achieve. And I think these are probably quite similar across all of the providers, where you're going to start by looking at the key concerns first of all. And the key concerns tend to be where you have a viral or copyleft type license such as GPL in your code base and what the impact of that will be. If you've got those kind of licenses, how they interact with other software. And Andrew, again, this morning was talking about those interactions and the risks that you might have. I think tomorrow, Jelane's going to do an overall introduction for quite a long presentation on open source generally, where I'm sure she'll cover exactly what those licenses mean and how the interaction and viral effect can work. But you tend to start by looking at these priorities based on the types of license. So your copyleft, then you move into commercial, then permissive. And what I've often seen is that you have code in there that may come up as a priority one and need to be dealt with, but actually when you sit down and talk about what that code does, it's not particularly relevant anymore. And often you can start by clearing out your license priority ones by looking at the functionality of the code and removing things. So you can actually strip out quite a lot from the repositories where the code's just been sitting around for years on end without being used or not being used anymore. Yeah, sure.
Is it okay to ask questions?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, don't just ask questions, give me an opinion or a suggestion.
About the priority, is it an example, or why would you say like that commercial licenses is something where you would look at priority 2 and license priority 1 is copyleft licenses? Because
Yeah.
according to my experience, there are many cases where you could be just okay with copyleft licenses.
Absolutely. So one of the things before you came into the room we talked about was scoping the project at the beginning, and I haven't spent a lot of time going through a policy yet because I want to come to that at the end. But those policy decisions, this is not the one way of doing it. This is an example. This is Flexera's priorities. Yeah. Yeah. No. This is an example. There's lots of ways to skin a cat, and I've put that this is Flexera's because the last couple of slides were actually Black Duck, and I wanted to be fair and not particularly recommend any one product. But this is the way they've chosen to run through it, and it's not dissimilar from what I've seen anywhere else either. There are nuances. You might want to start with commercial licenses because this was supposed to be a check of your open source, and you might want to start with false positives because if you're getting a commercial license on an open source check, you're going to question that. So you don't have to do it in any particular order, but generally I've seen that copyleft licenses and commercial come up, whether that's one or two, up to the organization and its goals. What I found is then when you start to work through this, you make your decisions about what you can remove, how the software interacts, and whether there's anything technical you can do, and work back and forwards between the legal person and the technologists looking for solutions. I'm going to flick on from this, but I'll come back. Now, I've put 4 slides in here that I may come back to, but I only wanted to raise a very high level, which is that when we're talking about open source licenses, generally you're talking about a license that fits the OSI's definition. I've put a couple of things in there to explain what copyleft, the viral effect, and permissive are. I don't know if we'll have time to really go through that, and Jelena will cover it tomorrow. This slide's gone a bit funny. Anyway, so the key things that you're going to look at there are how you resolve those issues based on those priorities. And I think that you can split it out. You can start by working through priorities 1 to 4, but also work through how you're going to do the fixes. And you sort of end up with a matrix of actions from that. So what I've found is that if the technology team say, actually, does anybody ever remember that we've run package Y, and nobody in the organization thinks they use it anywhere, the easiest thing is to strip it out. If they are linking, for example, between copyleft pieces of code, they might decide that they can move it into a dynamic structure so that there's not the risks of the viral effect. But it's very much a back and forth conversation, and I think that the solutions that are legal tend to be your last resort. So you start with the technological fixes, the technological solutions, look at the legal basic licensing issues, and then look at what I would call the legal hocus pocus, which is where you really have to understand what the licenses mean to know whether you're compliant or not. So if I give you an example, and this is part of the reason I put the OSI slide in there and the definition, the reference to the definition, is that I've seen licenses come up that aren't OSI approved, will come up saying they're open source, but they don't actually meet that definition and aren't approved licenses. There was one that I came across called Greensleeves that was an example of that, where it says, yes, you're free to use this software on effectively open source terms, but if you start to use the software in any way that has a commercial implication, you have to come back and get a proprietary license from us and a paid-for license. Now, to me, that's not open source, And I think to most people it's not open source, but those are the kind of things that you have to know when you're working through the license terms. So as you work through this, you may decide that you want to have a deeper dive, and you may actually want to go and, I think it was referred to by a colleague, is by hand review the code packages that are in there if you think there's anything that's not coming through in the check, because when they run these audit tools, they're only ever going to be as good as the database that they're run against. So that's something you may want to do. And some of these slides have got a bit weird. So here we should have a lovely picture of a bill of materials which hasn't come up. And I think you mentioned this morning the software bill of materials. Your ultimate goal in any audit has to be to get a bill of materials which is clean. So a bill of materials where you can see what packages are in your repository or in your distribution or in the product that you've created, what licenses they're on, that the licenses interact and are used appropriately, and that you comply with the terms. So if you have to put attributions in the headers, that you've got those notices in the code. If you've got to make an offer for the source, that's done. So if we sort of move to step 4 of what I wanted to say to you, is really what do you do once you've done that practical physical audit? And it sort of goes back full circle to your kickoff meeting. So for me, that's when you draft the policy. You've probably been thinking about a lot of things from the kickoff meeting. You've probably had discussion around whether you want copyleft licensing or not, whether you're going to be mixing proprietary and open source, whether you're going to contribute to projects, and if you are, what sort of license agreement or CLA is going to be appropriate for your organization. Will that be signed by the company? Will it be signed by the individual? Sometimes organizations go down a route of having blacklist clauses, whitelist clauses, greylist clauses. So the response to code coming in will be different. And those procedures and policies sort of come out of the process of audit. But you may well find that you've kept notes as you've gone through the audit where you've seen issues arise and you don't want that to happen again, or you want to work in a particular way. So it may be that you haven't had proper time stamping on the code that's come into your repositories, and you decide, having done the audit, that you don't want that problem again going forwards. So you're going to put some sort of tool in place that makes sure that won't happen. This is as long as a piece of string. It's like saying, do we have to do this bit first or second? There are certain key things that need to be in there. And again, anybody who saw Andrew Katz's talk this morning on the Open Chain project will find a free guide to the things that you would put into a policy and the kinds of procedures that you would be looking for from Open Chain. And that will sort of get you back to having the good hygiene, so that going forward, you don't need to do an audit on the basis that something has gone wrong, you're getting investment, etc. But if you are doing it on the basis that you're going to have to settle with somebody around something litigious or give some sort of warranty because you're taking investment, you really need to think about what you'll give, and it has to be limited to the nature of the software. So my view is that nobody in their right mind is going to give a broad IP indemnity or IP warranty against anything open source, because there are different ways of looking at open source, but ultimately the chances are that something has been contributed by a community team at some point in the process, and it should be, and that shouldn't be a problem. And I'm sure that you'll have a CLA which they've signed off on, but it would be wrong for them to have been asked to take on huge liability as an individual not being paid for the work they're doing. So because the contributions won't just be corporate ones, they'll be individual and small projects, that natural cascade or flow of liability shouldn't be what you would expect in a proprietary agreement. And my experience, at least, is the sort of industry is held on that, and even the big corporates will generally not give huge liability. Yes, if they're selling particular kinds of products, there might be some sort of legal assurance or indemnity attached to that, but that's something they're actually selling you. That's not just the warranty they're giving. So it should be qualified. It has to be best of knowledge, because you can never, ever do a full scan knowing that absolutely every line of code is going to have been in that library that you're scanning against. But that's likely to need to somehow qualify against or relate to state of the art. And that's where my experience is they'll ask you to have a proprietary tool, not a fossology, that you're running your code base against. And you need to think long and hard about whether you want to give any indemnities. So there's a difference between a warranty and an indemnity. A warranty is a promise, whereas an indemnity is actually a commitment to pay somebody pound for pound the loss that they incurred, depending on the wording that you've got in there. And if you're going to do that and you're actually going to put money against it, you have to think about what you've had come in and how you've taken that software. And that in itself would affect your policies and the processes that you put in place. So just while we're talking about policies, I have a couple of other thoughts, and then I'm really hoping that you guys will get into a discussion. There are things that you will put in your policies that aren't in any way related to what you're going to get out of your audits. And it's unfortunate David still isn't in the room, because we were talking about software patents, and he was talking this morning about implied licenses above and beyond what you might have or devolved from the open source licenses you've got. And the open source licenses will give you a right to use the copyright and code. Some of them will make claims about patents. And you need to decide as an organization, as part of your open source policy, whether you're going to patent anything around open source, whether you're going to have any licenses around that. And one of the ways of doing that is to look at the sort of defensive patent organizations. OIN is one that I work for, to be absolutely clear, but it's a zero-cost defensive patent pool. Now, Jamie, who's going to speak after me specifically about the defensive patent strategies and how they relate to open source, is going to explain that OIN isn't a patent pool, but I've grown up calling it one, so you just have to bear with me on that. And also, I think if you're doing an audit from a corporate point of view, coming into the world where collaboration and open source is going to be the norm for your business. So you're in a sector that perhaps traditionally hasn't used or contributed greatly to open source and is now dealing with open source projects like financial services. I think you have to think long and hard about how you're going to collaborate and what your commitments are going to be. I was involved in the setup of OpenStack 7 years ago now. I was part of the legal committee that put the infrastructure around that and the governance policies in place. And you really have to think about things like your IP and what commitments you have and who's authorized to do what within the organization. So I really would like to stop talking because I've talked quite a lot, quite quickly, but I'm happy to discuss anything around the audits that you might want to, or to take feedback or questions or comments. Or you're going to look at me blankly. It's quite a dry topic for this time of day. I apologize. I don't. Do you know any audit jokes? No. It's the audit joke.
I'll have to think of one.
Yeah.
I'll just give some of my feedback. Thanks for the presentation. Here's some things I've seen. I do a lot of audits. I work for Flexera, doing a lot of M&A audits, baseline audits for about 15 years. And maybe 3 quick points on what I heard you say today. One is around the kickoff call.
Yeah.
It's been my experience that the kickoff call is really important because developers have a hard time getting you the code that you need.
Yeah.
If you just said, send me over a bundle of your product, 9 times out of 10, it's not the right stuff.
Yeah.
It's missing a lot of things. So you have to have a kickoff call, explain why you're doing it, what's going on. Otherwise, it's garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah.
It's a waste of everybody's time.
Yeah.
Number 2 is around the policy. I've seen a lot of companies and people spend a lot of time before they do the audit, spend a lot of time on policy, and then they do the audit, and nothing, beyond the standard stuff, nothing that they expected to came out of the audit. But they ended up with this long tail of other licenses and conditions that they didn't even expect. And they have to basically redo that thing again. So my experience has been, do a little policy, but then expect that the audit is really going to open your eyes.
Yeah, totally agree. And that's when you make the decisions at the end, but be aware of it and carry it through with you. Yeah.
And then maybe this lastly, the remediation, which is we're auditing because we're expecting to find problems.
Yeah.
And you should expect to find problems. And that's where the real kind of trouble can sometimes begin, because you're probably going to find stuff that you don't know how to fix, or your team says we don't have time to fix this. And so in the M&A case, it's great because you can affect valuation. Go, no go.
Yeah.
When you're doing internal work, you sometimes have to trade off being pragmatic versus finding all the problems versus what we figure out to fix, and that becomes really political.
And I think that's absolutely essential because it comes back to working out what the goals of doing this are. Why are you doing it? Who's involved? Have you really got the right decision makers? Because if you don't have a CTO or somebody at that level making the decisions, you're not going to get those decisions for weeks or months on end. So it really is a business need, a business case. I haven't seen one where we haven't thought that we fixed everything, but we've made pragmatic decisions around the final fixes. So your list just gets shorter and shorter. And it really should be a very, very interactive process of sitting down. I haven't seen so many commercial people in it. Yes, from the people from the audit tool providers, but not from within businesses. From my experience, it really tends to be the technologists and the lawyers working together. And I think part of the thing for me is you've called it a call, and I'm sure that's how it often ends up being. But I actually think a face-to-face meeting is quite important at the start of these projects, and trying to sit down and really scope things out that way if you can. Any other thoughts, feedback?
So how do you find it works in sort of large organisations where there's actually thousands of projects, as opposed to, what you've been talking about sounds more like it's a single code base that you're looking at and doing a review on.
Yeah.
We're looking at 4,000 applications.
You can either, there's multiple ways of doing it. I know it's huge, it's absolutely huge. And this is what Andrew and I were talking about. So I don't know if you noticed in his presentation this morning, if you were in it, he had under 100 packages. And he sort of really was pushing me to talk about a deep dive. That's not something that I've really seen done. I've always seen an audit done using a tool, because the ones that I've worked on have been enormous. And you're sitting with reams and reams of paper at the end of it, trying to work out what bit goes there and who's doing what. I think possibly depends how it ties up, but you may want to split it into areas, and you may want to make the CTO the person responsible for final decisions, but have multiple mini projects working as mini audits, feeding back into that overall and agreeing between a group of people representing those projects where the company policies and the lines are going to be on them. Yeah.
Policy first,
well, I think what you do is you start with some basics. So you would hope that by the time you get to the stage of doing an audit, there's been enough of a conversation that you're going to have some materials within the organisation. So you're going to acknowledge that you've got open source as a start. And from there tends to have been some statement put into some manual in a big company. So I would start by getting that out and have everybody laugh at it or agree that it's actually what it should be. And then go back to that as you get to the end of the audit, but revisit individual issues as you go. Because it's exactly what Jeff was saying. As you go through it, the issues that you have will not be what you expected. That's part of the reason for doing it. If you knew what the issues were, you wouldn't be looking blind at it. But it really will vary how long it will take to do. How quickly have you ever seen things?
So it depends on how deep you're going. So if we're looking at a single company for M&A purposes or a baseline, and it's a couple big products, we see a lot of times where you try to fit it into a 2-week turnaround time for M&A and things like that. You might put multiple people on it, but that's the goal of the M&A process. For looking at an internal company, you might say we have dozens, hundreds, thousands of products. That's probably multiple years, but you're also probably going to have a trade-off of fidelity and depth.
I've never seen it take years. I've seen it take months, but not years. And where you get to with that tends to be that you accept you've got to a certain point and create the policy and the processes for the go forward, and hope you're sweeping certain things up as you go.
Yeah, I think the one thing I would say is that if your auditing is not driven by a particular event, like an M&A event or something like that, if your auditing is driven by it's time we get into compliance. We were talking about this earlier, but what I recommend doing is start with a product, start with your biggest product,
and split it up,
the most distribution, and go through the audit process for that. And then once you see how that kind of works, and you see who you need to pull in, you see sort of like where does it take longer, then you can key up the process to work on all the other products. But don't start everything at once, right? Like,
I think that's really good advice, actually.
One product at a time. Because then you learn from that, and then the next one can go faster.
And I think it all comes back to why are you doing it. This example is where you're looking at something because it is that good hygiene, good housekeeping. We all ought to do it in our organisations. But to get the money to do the audit in the first place, there tends to be a prompter. And if that prompter is specific to a product, that's the first product you're going to do. I've not really seen people have to sit down and make a decision. The decision's sort of been made for them when they start doing this because it needs to be done. I don't think I've ever encountered an organisation that's just done the audit because they thought it was a good idea.
Those are my clients.
Yeah, okay.
I don't know why. I just think compliance is a good idea.
No, I don't generally see organisations ready to spend a lot of money quickly, but unless there's that reason. Anything else?
So the third-party managed apps, those that are dependent on open source libraries and those they need to all be evaluated, don't they? Those end user license agreements.
This is a constant sort of debate because the license should be in the code. It shouldn't just be in the contract. So I don't necessarily think you should be reviewing the license. If you've got any form of open source software in there, irrespective of the contracts, any bill of materials or schedules attached to that contract with EULAs in it, there should actually be some reference in the code, in the attribution clause, in the notice, or the actual license that's attached to the code itself. You shouldn't have to go back to your commercial agreements. If you are, there's something wrong and your process needs looked at.
Do you need to register those licenses independently in your CMDB or not? Would you recommend it, even though they're part of a packaged app that
you're getting back to what a EULA is, and you could have a whole hour session on apps and app stores and licensing and additional conditions and GPL and whether or not people want to sue Apple, and it's a whole separate conversation. Personally, there should be nothing that you have to go to a contract to look for. It should all be, if it's open source, it should all be in there. It doesn't mean it will be, but it should be, and that's kind of what you're trying to drive out in the process. So it's not beyond the realms of possibility that you will have to go and look at a commercial agreement to get the EULAs or to speak to the provider to find out where they are, but they should have been in the code base anyway. The notices in the code base should reference it. So I'm being told to wrap up, but if anybody wants to talk more about it, I'm happy to. Thank you.
Thank you.